Welcome to this 5th edition of DIIS' Gender and Insecurity Seminar Series, this time on gender, peace and security. My name is Cold-Ravnkilde. I'm a senior researcher here at DIIS, and together with my colleague, also senior researcher Robin May Schott, we have taken the 20 years of anniversary of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 as a point of departure for discussing some of the well-known challenges to this women, peace and security agenda. Though progress has been made in certain areas, we are still far from reaching the objectives of reducing conflict-related violence, including women in peacekeeping, negotiations, as well as in post-conflict resolution. Furthermore, the Women, Peace and Security agenda has been heavily criticized. For instance, by instrumentalizing women as new security actors, and an idea that these intrinsic feminine virtues can be of value, a real contribution in, for instance, countering violent extremism, or bringing about organizational change in gender-biased institutions. To put more focus on how gendered relations of power reproduce inequalities and insecurity along the lines of gender, race, and class, we would like to, as this seminar series also indicate, to move away from the notion of women, peace, and security to gender, peace, and security. While also bringing in these questions of intersectionality and the way in which various forms of inequality often operate together and exacerbate one another. To have a debate about this today, we are very proud to present our invited speakers that hopefully will also represent an interesting mix of both policymakers and academics. First, Marita Sørheim-Rensvik is Special Envoy for Women, Peace and Security in the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Marita has worked more than 15 years as a diplomat, and she will give us an overview of where we stand in relation to UN Security Council 1325 today. Second, Nina Villén is Director for the African Program at the Egmont Institute for International Relations. She's also Associate Professor at the University Libre de Bruxelles. Nina has worked on various aspects of politics of peacekeeping and gender and the military. In her latest article in International Affairs, Nina Villén calls for a better debate about how to transform gender-biased institutions without reinforcing gender stereotypes and gender inequality. And hopefully she will say much more about this in a minute. I'm also very proud to present Marcia Henry, Associate Professor at the Department of Gender Studies at the London School of Economics. Marcia has worked extensively on the everyday practices of peacekeeping, and particularly with a focus on peacekeepers from the global south through the lens of intersectionality and militarization. Before I give the word to you, Marita, I would just like to say a few remarks on technicalities here today. For questions, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, not the chat function. You can write down questions as we go along. We will gather them and then we will discuss them in the Q&A session, which will be chaired by Robin May Schott. And finally, this webinar will be recorded and uploaded at the DIIS YouTube channel. So without further ado, Marita, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Signe, and good afternoon, everyone. It's good to be here with you, and I'm honored to take part. And to be honest with you, now I already want to be discussing all of these issues that you raised in your introduction, so I think this will be an interesting afternoon. But let me start where I intended to start. 20 years ago, it was the women organizations and the peace movement that demanded a change in the way we build and sustain peace. They insisted that security was more than state security, that it had to be about human security too. And peacemaking, as well as peace itself, needed to be inclusive. for it to address the needs and priorities of all. Researchers presented data that could not be ignored, amongst other on women in peacekeeping, and countries from every part of the world took it on. The Beijing Declaration and Plan of Action of 1995 was one important milestone. Bangladesh Presidency of Security Council in March 2000 was another. It was Bangladesh that initiated the first Security Council 8 of March presidential statement that laid the foundation for the resolution to come. And Namibia followed up in October the same year, building on a meeting that was held in their capital. They saw Security Council Resolution 1325 through. All this to say that this agenda is quite unique, truly driven by women and peace activists, and founded on academic research from the very start. And despite what some may claim or think, it is absolutely no Western agenda. It is through and through owned by countries in every part of the world. Just last week, we heard powerful statements from African countries on the Security Council and member states from different regions, recognizing that this is an agenda that women peace builders have fought for, not to be diminished in any way. Women's involvement in peace and security did not begin with Security Council Resolution 1325 20 years ago, of course. Women have always been peace builders and key actors in conflict prevention, as well as both victims and perpetrators in conflicts. The resolution merely recognizes these facts, but it was for the first time, and by adopting it, we, the member states, made a commitment to adjust our peace and security efforts accordingly. We may be frustrated by the slow progress, the persistent gaps, women's continued suffering, women's underrepresentation in peace and security structures, and we should be. Because a failure to include women and integrate women's needs, rights, and priorities in is not only unjust, it also makes our efforts less effective. Yet, as we prepare for the next 20 years, we should not overlook all that has been achieved. Consider peace processes. Women's rights and participation did not feature prominently in the majority of peace processes in the 90s. Today, an omission to that extent would be impossible. We have networks now of women mediators that clearly demonstrate that competent and experienced women are ready to be consulted, engaged, and deployed. It is impossible to state that the right women cannot be found. We have models now for inclusion that, despite not being perfect, we know this, provides a way forward when the parties' delegations themselves do not include women, or when civil society is not being heard. The parties' no is no longer a complete end of the discussion. We have a growing body of research that indicates that it makes a difference whether women are included or not. It is difficult now to claim that inclusion can wait, while evidence suggests that it's vital for success. Today, there are policies in place. 86 countries, as well as regional and sub-regional organizations, have plan of actions for women, peace, and security. Training has changed, monitoring is improving. I'm not suggesting that it's all good. We are still far from where we need to be. You can read the Secretary General's report for this year to the Security Council, and it's disheartening. The progress is way too slow, but it's becoming easier to do the right thing and harder to disregard our obligations. We know what's required of us, and the global community and local activists know this too. So the challenges, where do we need to go from here to do better? Well, first of all, we know the focus needs to be on implementation, on doing what we said we would. Our general statements of women's inclusion and rights must create action on the ground in Afghanistan, in Yemen, in Libya. Translation into action must happen. We must operationalize our commitments. We need more women in conflict parties delegations. We need more women in official peacekeeping and mediation roles, but we also need to engage the local and national peace actors, civil society organizations, first responders, human rights defenders, the women and men who go about their lives in the midst of crisis and still manage to secure a life for themselves and their children. And we need both women and men in security to consider the gendered implications of the conflict as well as the peace that is being negotiated. Here are some concrete action points based on where we focus our efforts from the Norwegian side. First, we must do more to level the playing field from the very start. We cannot bring anyone to a table that doesn't exist, and discretion might inhibit us from discussing how we work with the parties. But even before conflict parties are brought to the negotiation table, we can and we should reach out to women and civil society to find out what their needs and priorities are and see if we can support them in order for them to be strengthened and have a stronger position and more leverage should there be a process in the future. If the agenda has been set and the delegations decided before women are brought in, inclusion will be all the more difficult later. Therefore, identifying key women actors at an early stage and investing in them is an investment in the future process too. Second, we must learn from other processes. We need to ask ourselves, how has inclusion been made possible in other processes? What made it difficult? How were the challenges overcome? From the Norwegian side, this is a focus at this point. I mean, it should be obvious, but I think continually we keep inventing the wheel. So we are working at this point to make sure that our teams to different processes share experiences, amongst other in annual gatherings. Third, we need to retain the focus on women's participation and rights after a peace accord has been signed. We know from experience that this phase can be long and hard and that backlashes may certainly occur. And so we must support the parties and civil society's efforts to promote women's representation in constitutional committees and security sector reform, and transitional justice and peace monitoring missions, because the specific focus on women's inclusion in peace and security seems to dwindle after an accord has been signed. Agreements must not only be agreed, but also implemented by women and men alike, and for women and men alike. Fourth, we need to ensure that different women are heard and engaged. Women are not one group. Of course, women like men should not be expected to have the same experiences, needs, or priorities. Intersectionality was mentioned. And yes, we need gendered actor and conflict analysis to a much larger extent, because unless we understand whom the women and the men are, what resources they possess, what grievances they have suffered, with whom they are connected, we lose out. Gender is only one factor to consider, although I would say one of the most important ones most often. But gender identity is another. Religion, ethnicity, geography, socioeconomic status, political affiliation, age, physical ability, etc. We have a job to do in that regard, but we are getting better, and some counts better than on others. Young women are increasingly in focus, for instance. And after the atrocity towards the Yazidi, the fact that minorities are more exposed to sexual violence, for instance, is also better understood. The Colombia process saw the LGBTI community engage profoundly, Afro-descendants, indigenous populations. Every such experience adds knowledge and capability and makes it harder to state that it's irrelevant or cannot be done. We need to see that the diversity is reflected as relevant at all levels and in all phases of our peace processes. An agenda that is so broadly owned needs to be led by an equally diverse group of mediators and envoys. And part of this responsibility lies with member states. It matters whom we appoint, nominate, and groom for positions. Fifth, consultations must lead to something. Part of what we do to include is consultations. It's an important tool. But the messages from consultations must go somewhere. Someone must receive them. We need an uptake mechanism so that consultations become more than appeasing exercises. We are working on it. The UN and regional organizations are too. We're exploring new ways of working constantly, but I predict that this point will require our attention for quite some time. Finally, women peace builder and human rights defenders are increasingly being harassed and threatened, violated and killed. This is a huge human rights problem and a big problem for our peace and security efforts that depend on their contributions. Therefore, their security must be our priority. Well, here were some challenges and some suggestions as to how to overcome them. This agenda was never about numbers. It intended to create a paradigm shift, recognizing that those who carry weapons and can stop the war might not be the best placed to create peace. So that's a challenge for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marita, for this very nice overview. It's nice to see that there are already some questions in the Q&A. Please write them down and keep them for later. Now, Nina Willi, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Signe. So in the coming minutes, I will discuss the risks related to the instrumentalization of uniformed female peacekeepers' participation in peace operations. And I will try to make 3 points during this talk. Firstly, when we instrumentalize women's participation, we also risk confusing normative agendas and evidence-based research. Secondly, instrumentalizing women's participations means that we're putting high expectations on female peacekeepers that we're not putting on male peacekeepers. In other words, the added value risks becoming the added burden. Thirdly, a way to avoid these challenges is to shift the focus away from women to the environment in which they are to be integrated, and to recruit representative leaders that are capable and willing to transform that environment. So starting with the first point, the risk of entangling normative agendas with evidence-based research. What I mean here is that there is a tendency, even among us academics, to argue for the inclusion of more women as peacekeepers, not just because of the right of women to participate, but moreover because we assume that women have a supposedly added value. The focus on female peacekeepers in this situation is linked to a host of arguments drawn from research and reports about women's added value. Women are supposedly better at diffusing tensions because of their more conciliatory attitudes. They are understood as better at ensuring assistance to victims of sexual violence and harassment because they are women, and thus both can better identify with female victims and make the victims feel more at ease. Female peacekeepers are less likely to be perpetrators of sexual violence. In addition, women may serve as deterrents for male peacekeepers to commit sexual violence. Or, as another researcher has stated, the quote, "Men behave better when in the presence of women from their own culture." More practically, female peacekeepers can search women at checkpoints in societies where gender segregation is prevalent and women are prohibited from interacting with men. Women are supposedly also better at establishing relations with local communities and local women's groups, and thereby providing better understanding of the local situation. These are all convincing arguments to why it's important to include women in peace operations. Yet many researchers have also pointed to the need to contextualize and nuance these arguments to better reflect reality and avoid reinforcing gender stereotypes. So what I'm saying here is not that this is not true, but I'm saying that it's difficult and it's risky to measure women's added value, not only because the percentage is so low that we won't get any liable results, but also because it risks backfiring if women are not living up to the expectations that are put on them. I'm also saying that there is research that shows that quite often women's added value in approaching local communities, for example, is difficult to assess. Not only because there is not that much contact between uniformed peacekeepers and the local community in general, but also because locals are more likely to see the uniform rather than the gender of the peacekeeper. In interviews with South African peacekeepers, for example, it became clear that context mattered for when female peacekeepers actually could interact with the local population. In the DRC, the women soldiers saw that they could more easily establish relationship with the local women than their male counterparts. However, when they were in Sudan, they had limited access to the local community due to an assumption that female peacekeepers attracted rebel attacks. So the female soldiers were therefore relegated to the base camps, thus impeding all interaction with the local community. Or as a male officer explained, in Sudan, we have to put them in the back seat. We rather keep them less visible. We try not to take them to the red zones. This statement exemplifies research that shows how female peacekeepers are disproportionately deployed to safe spaces and tasks, meaning assignments to countries that are considered less dangerous. On the other hand, another female officer said that her uniform gave her status and protected her from gender stereotypical behavior, letting her interact with male population in strongly patriarchal societies like Saudi Arabia and Afghanistan. So these discrepancies underline the importance of understanding research findings in the right context and in the right culture. And with regard to the assumption that women peacekeepers can serve as deterrents for sexual violence or harassment, there is, again, little research that shows that this is the case. And from an ethical perspective, this is a very difficult claim to make. Women in uniform are in a minority, and they are unlikely to be capable of changing the behavior of the majority. It's also very problematic to expect women to tell on their male colleagues, especially so as female peacekeepers or women in uniform are more likely to be victims of sexual harassment than women in any other occupation. So I wanted to be clear here that I'm not saying that there is no added value of women peacekeepers. I'm saying that often arguments about women's added value to peacekeeping comes more from expectations of what women could add than what they actually do add, depending on the culture, the context, and the conditions in which they are deployed. And here I'm coming to my second challenge, the expectations that are put on women peacekeepers. As you've just heard, there are quite a lot of expectations on how women should make peacekeeping operations more effective and more efficient. Yet I think it's important to avoid putting gender stereotypical expectations on female and male peacekeepers. This is important because research has shown that women are trying to live up to these expectations by doing more than their male counterparts in order to prove that they do in fact add something extra, something that only women can add. Some research has shown that female peacekeepers often work a second shift, engaging with local communities as volunteer work, while some women peacekeepers ask for specific training in sexual and gender-based violence because they were expected to perform better than their male colleagues in these areas. In a discussion with a female peacekeeper I had, she explained that she reached out to the local community by giving public speeches at various organizations about being a female military, trying to show a good example and live up to the expectation of being a role model. Yet these speeches were done on her free time, meaning that she too did a second shift. And when I pointed this out, she commented, "Well, it's true that my male predecessors had a lot of time to play golf in their free time, but I couldn't miss the opportunity to make a difference as a woman." So this will to make a difference and to show the added value seems to be a recurrent aspect with female peacekeepers. And it reflects the fact that the pressure to add something extra does not only come from external sources, but is also internalized with the female peacekeepers themselves. So what I'm trying to say here is that the more expectations that we put on women to add something extra, to increase the operational effectiveness, the more burden we're putting on women that are already in a very delicate position as clear minority in a very masculine and male-dominated environment. And if this point was implicit here, I should make it explicit. These expectations are not put on male peacekeepers and are therefore not conducive to gender equality. My third point is a suggestion to turn the table around, and instead of focusing on the female peacekeepers, we should focus on the working environment in which they are to be integrated, that is the military. That is an environment which, for the most part, is constructed by and for the men, with very little space for women. Men are, in other words, the default setting in most uniformed professions. This can range from aspects such as not having a gynecologist as part of the medical team to wrong sizes for army clothes for uniforms and body armor. A report from the Armed Forces in Sweden from 2017, for example, showed that approximately 40% of the women did not have body protection in the right sizes. These are practical issues that should be easy to address to make the military a much more attractive workplace for women. But of course, the most important aspect is to work on how to make the working environment more positive, more inclusive, and valuing diversity more. For that, we need representative leaders who are willing to push forward and who are willing to engage and who value diversity and inclusion rather than homogeneity and exclusion. And to conclude, instrumentalizing women's participation as making the peace operations more effective and efficient also means that there is a risk of a backlash if women are not living up to the expectations. In other words, if women fail to live up to the gendered expectations that are put on them, if they fail to bring the added value, should they no longer be allowed to serve in peace operations at all? And I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nina, for bringing out both the importance of cultural context and understanding the difficult environment of the military. And thanks also for keeping time. I will now give the word to Marcia, if you're ready, Marcia.
Yes, I am. Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this great event. I was supposed to, a long time ago when we began discussing this event and what we would speak about, I think I said that I was going to speak about intersectionality and masculinity and militarization, but I have changed my mind a little bit, but I am going to speak on intersectionality and the necessity of critical theory. But I'm going to talk a little bit about women, peace and security and gender, peace and security in academic settings, because I think this is a space in which I think we need to pay a bit more attention in thinking about what has taken place in the last 20 years. So I can return in the questions if people want to questions of intersectionality and masculinity and militarization. I'd be happy to address those further then. Okay, this year sees the equal celebration and criticism of all that is associated with UNSC 1325. On the one hand, marking the 20 years that have passed since the inception of 1325, signals that issues regarding women, peace and security have steadily remained on the global humanitarian agenda, and to some extent in the public spotlight. On the other hand, increasing contestations over different aspects of the women, peace and security agenda, from activists and grassroots organizations calling out superficial and empty-handed state promises, and academics challenging gender binaries, colonial hangovers, and global north-centered programming, has meant that 1325 and related resolutions remain problematic in the eyes of many critical feminists in particular. While the numerous collection of essays recently published attempt to address the more critical interventions in debates about protection, prevention, participation, and post-conflict reconstruction, and draw on a variety of theoretical traditions, such as theories of the continuum of violence, or theories of variations in sexual violence in particular, and also the political economy approach, alongside more recent uses of queer and post-colonial theories. There still lacks an interrogation of women, peace and security from the perspective of, say, intersectional and critical race theorists. What can we learn about women, peace and security from critical race feminism? And how is this vital to thinking and acting for the next 20 years? I start from the argument that whiteness is central to the operation of women, peace and security, and illustrate this by examining the academic settings in particular. I want to put forward an argument that I think is worth dwelling on. Gender, peace and security, or WPS, so I'll either say GPS or WPS from now on, in universities is a white knowledge project, characterized and emboldened by white authority and expertise, and which consistently centers knowledge from the geo-epistemic home of the global north. This is evident in a multitude of ways. When we examine the representation of senior white faculty researching and teaching on GPS, WPS, and I include in those centers Monash, Georgetown, Prio, and LSE, where I am a member of faculty. The syllabi, which can be dominated by global north and white authors. And finally, the range of speakers at events sponsored by universities and other similar research institutions, many of which continue to include women of color, but very often and importantly, as practitioners, activists, and artists. While, as my presence attests, there are a range of activists and scholars representing diverse perspectives and faculty of color working in these institutional spaces, there is a clear absence of Black feminists and Black academics. Considering that so much of the WPS focus is on those women made especially vulnerable by conflict or armed violence, many of which feature and figure on the front pages of WPS promotional material, it makes for a very stark contrast and a sharp casting of whiteness when considering the politics of speaking, knowledge production, and resources for research and practice. Why, for example, haven't the political economy theorists of women, peace, and security yet considered this lopsided division of labor, production, and representation? So I want to consider the adoption of critical feminist race concepts within WPS spaces as an opportunity for discussion on the necessity of taking seriously such ideas as intersectionality in strengthening an understanding and commitment to anti-racism that should be a central part of any gender peace and security project. It could be an example of how GPS, WPS could exercise a broader form of reflexivity and engage in decolonizing and anti-racist practices more directly. So I want to do this by reflecting briefly on two examples of development more locally, but that I feel have a great deal to say about the necessity of critical race feminism for discussions of GPS. So in two recent blog posts by my colleagues at the Center for Women, Peace and Security at LSE, the theory of intersectionality is put forward in relation to discussions of, first, survivor-centered approaches to conflict-related sexual violence by Dr. Elena Stavretska, and two, women's violence and the law in considering the case of Shamima Begum by Sherry Lebensky. In both of these blog posts, which address key concerns for women, peace and security scholars, they touch on issues of intersectional inequalities and the intersections of systems of oppression in order to highlight the ways in which gender alone as a single axis is insufficient to consider the lives of women affected by conflict. Intersectionality is a radical concept that originates in the context of Black feminist and critical race theories, Black women's lived experiences, and a racialized epistemic intervention in gender studies itself. Intersectionality points to the fact that women's lives are never determined by one system of oppression, such as patriarchy, but are intersected by multiple systems, by capitalism, by racism, drawing, of course, on the experiences of the US context. This has an appeal for those thinking through the complexity of gendered experiences in conflict and post-conflict contexts, as it allows scholars to think about the multiple layers that structure women's and men's lives. But what happens when critical Black feminist theories are introduced into gender, peace, and security contexts? What is the transformative value of such critical theories? Importantly, Black women are simply not present in any of these spaces as visionaries, as leaders. What ends up happening is that intersectionality comes to stand in for Black women, or it becomes a simpler device that draws attention to differences without challenging systems of power that result in unequal outcomes, both in conflict zones and in educational settings. Thus, intersectionality without Black women tells us something about the ongoing production of white privilege in GPS and WPS spaces. To adapt Cynthia Enlow's words, I would ask, where are the Black women in gender, peace, and security? A second and interesting example, more recently, on the 21st of October, in response to a general debate on Black History Month being held by members of Parliament, the UK government's Equalities Minister, Kemi Badenoch, took to the dispatch box to describe critical race theory as, quote, an ideology that sees my Blackness as victimhood and their whiteness as oppression. Anybody can do a search for the various clips of this video of this Equalities Minister speaking about critical race theory, if you like, but I didn't want to take up any time in the presentation to show you it, although it's a fascinating video. This is a seemingly opposite example of the ways in which critical race theories are being mobilized within the domestic context. In this situation, the party in power is publicly sidelining, marginalizing, and stigmatizing the use of critical race theory as part of the domestic curriculum. So Kemi is arguing that we shouldn't be including critical race theories in the high school or in the school curriculum. Terms such as white privileged are mentioned here by the MP as examples of racially biased teaching. Vouched for by a Black MP and minister, the video clip had a ripple effect across social media sites. And so I wanted to take this opportunity to think about the impact of such official stance in relation to critical theories and how this might lead to the narrowing of reforms within academic and practitioner spaces of GPS and WPS. As I view intersectionality as an integral part of critical race theory, I wonder what effect this is bound to have on academic spaces more broadly, as well as institutional centers of women, gender, peace, and security. What is the future of academic research and teaching in GPS if the general political atmosphere is hostile to such social justice theories? Furthermore, what is the impact of such thinking on practitioner communities working towards challenging the racism endemic amongst the humanitarian aid sector, for example, where such activists such as Shaista Aziz have argued that along with sexual exploitation and abuse and sexual harassment in humanitarian aid contexts, racism, Islamophobia, and xenophobia plague the humanitarian sector, and that feminists committed to improving the lives of those affected by conflict need to take seriously questions of race, racism, and Islamophobia. I use these two brief examples to show how the generation or evolution of research and teaching on gender, peace, and security and women, peace, and security relies on a depoliticization of theories and concepts in order to maintain conversations and cordial conversations with government and with funders. This depoliticization in academia is something that contributes to the maintenance, what I argue is contributes to the maintenance of white privilege, white supremacy, and the continued exclusion of Black women from a seat at the table. This is where the theory of intersectionality and the contributions of critical race theory could enable women, peace, and security space to be one that reflects less on the pacification and satisfaction of governments and pushes and challenges systems of oppression and structures of inequality, both domestically and globally. Where, for example, does the campaign initiated by intersectional feminist scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, titled Say Her Name, feature in discussions about the 20 years of 1325? In this campaign, Crenshaw argues that Black women in the US have continually been marginalized, even within efforts to draw attention to police brutality against Black men. In saying their names, Crenshaw points us, as GPS scholars, to the critical theories that we need to help us challenge the global inequalities that persist and that continue to hinder efforts to make GPS or WPS agendas ones that are committed to anti-racism and therefore one of inclusion rather than division. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcia, for bringing attention to also our own institutionalized bias, both in academics and practitioners' lives, and also in the way racialized labored hierarchies continue. We are actually a little bit ahead of time, and I think that's great because that leaves more room for discussion. I can see that the Q&A session is already active. I also think this is a particularly interesting moment while we're looking at the US election. I keep thinking how, even though we criticize the norms and institutions, the basis of human rights, of the multilateralism, but these norms and institutions are also increasingly contested and under threat for these developments that we're going through right now, which I think is just a point. And I'm gonna then open for the Q&A. Please, Robin.
Thank you. Okay. Am I on screen? I want to thank all of our speakers and for great presentations. I can't see whether I'm on screen. Can somebody tell me whether I am?
You're on screen.
Okay, great, thank you. And as Sina was saying, we have a good amount of time for discussion, and that's great. But before we open it up to Q&A, I know Sina and I myself have a couple of questions. The speakers may themselves want to ask each other questions. It was a rather intense dialogue here. But please go ahead and use the Q&A and use the upvote function. But before I open it up to the audience, Sina, please, I know you had a couple of questions. We talked about this.
Yes, definitely. Thank you also from me for very interesting presentations. And I would also perhaps this question of contested multilateralism, Marita, maybe you have a few points on how you see the work on the 1325 in that global context of new normative change. Nina Willin, also thank you very much. I was very intrigued by this concept of the added burden. I have also worked on peacekeepers in female peacekeepers in South Africa, and it was often mentioned by male peacekeepers how women were actually a added burden, particularly in these questions around whether women could contribute in combat roles. So I'd like you to address that. And also, as I know you're also working on MINUSMA and how we see that international peacekeeping is in deploying in increasingly difficult environments of asymmetrical warfare. We see a what some would probably say a militarization also of peacekeeping in more robust mandates. And how do you see then some of the challenges, and but perhaps also, yeah, because one thing you often hear with peacekeeping is that the deployment of peacekeepers is a national, the national contingent is the national military that deploys. So often the amount of women that participate is often a reflection of how much women are included in the military nationally. So that may be also a place for a discussion on where this work should be ongoing. And finally, Marcia, thank you very much also for bringing these questions of intersectionality. And I was just, because I can see somebody in the chat is also asking us all perhaps to discuss more this move away from women, peace and security to the aspect of gender. But then bringing in these questions of intersectionality, I think also raises the point of what are the limitations to the concept of gender? Should we say something about how far this stretch is it? Could you perhaps elaborate this point that you say that gender inequalities cannot account for the experiences of women in conflict situations? Yeah, so that was some of my remarks. Thank you very much.
Okay, who would like, am I unmuted? Who would like to start off on answering that series of questions?
Well, I'll be happy to start if you want.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. I actually want to comment on so very many things. I hope I'll have the chance later on, but I wanted to mention one thing with regards to what Marcia said on whites being dominant in research and in the whole sphere of women, peace, security, gender, peace and security, which of course is a fact and it's unfortunate. But I wanted to just mention Accord as a fantastic resource. And also the very many women in AU FemWise, for instance, of whom quite a few also have academic backgrounds. And I also wanted to mention the Namibian Center of Excellence that was launched, I think the 31st, that was the plan anyway, 31st of October. And I have great hopes for that center. I think it was fantastic that Namibia launched the idea and that they moved forward on that. I still don't know exactly what it will be, but I'm excited about it. So let's hope we'll see some more African women, at least, moving into this field in the same way as we've seen Accord do. Okay, on a few of the questions that you mentioned with regards to me as well. So the global normative situation, I don't know if you're referring to the most recent negotiations in the Security Council. But what I will say is that this can be so many different narratives depending on where you start. But part of what is true, at least, is that the ownership to this agenda is growing. There is, if you look at the rhetorics, for instance, if you look at the words that are being pronounced in the Security Council and the commitments that are being made, they're of a different quality now than they used to be. So I think you see member states in general and on the Security Council specifically have, or they express greater ownership to the agenda, and they have more depth and more breadth in what they're saying. That, of course, is only a start. But as Åsa Renier, the deputy leader of UN Women, recently said, you know, I don't know of any cause within this field that has been won without words moving first. So I think we see words moving first. And if they're only followed by action, it's wonderful. So I think there is a growing ownership to the agenda rhetorically. And I think there's also definitely a greater understanding of what it means. If you look at what's being said, there is greater detail, it's more specified, it's commenting on specific issues relevant to people's lives. So it's no longer as generic as it used to be. And I think that change has happened only in a few years. You'll also see it reflected in the mandates and resolutions that instruct UN missions, at least in this field. And you'll also see it in countries like Norway's work or others, that we are much more specific about the guidelines for our people, appointing leads, ensuring accountability, that we ask the right questions. So I think all of this is evolving in a positive way. Now, when it comes to some of the debates that we have within this field, we see clearly that there are also toxic issues, or issues that appear to be toxic. I will say, though, that most of them are not really exclusive for the Women, Peace and Security agenda. As soon as you start talking about sexual reproductive health and rights, or LGBTI rights, or human rights defenders, this will be difficult to move forward in any global setting, well, presently at this moment. So I think what is actually unique to this agenda is that there isn't much disagreement at the heart of it, saying, you know, that yes, women need to take part on different levels and in all phases of peace making and peace building and peace, well, sustaining peace, also prevention. And I think there's also not much disagreement about women's rights needing to be taken into account. But the fact that we are discussing more in detail means also that we still have a lot of discussions about what it entails. So what does it mean to respect women's rights? What does it mean that women are to participate? In what kinds of roles? So we are having a lot of agreement, which when broken down, you'll find a lot of disagreements as well. Yet still, I will say at the core, a lot of unity and very little resistance at the core. Now, the resolution that was recently negotiated demonstrated many things, but what it did demonstrate was that a lot of countries are willing, understand very well what issues are at stake, and are willing to be very strong to protect the agenda. At the same time, we also need to remember that Russia, China, all of these countries have agreed all along on the major, on the core issues in this agenda. Well, that's a start for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Marcia or Nina, did you want to add to respond to some of Stina's comments?
I'm happy to respond more generally and to touch on issues that Marita already brought up, if you don't mind. I guess I wanted to comment on a couple of things that, you know, I think relate to what everyone has said in terms of, you know, clearly it's not possible to think about 1325 and the last 20 years, you know, without thinking about all of the challenges, all of the gaps, all of the problems that remain. And I think that that critical perspective is hugely important and has, you know, and I think feminists and those working in government have been maintaining that critical lens. And I think that's to be commended. I think that is a really important aspect, that there already has been a reflexive element to the formal agenda. And so lots of feminists have been trying to work with what is available, the spaces that are available to try and make some serious changes and to improve the lives of women in conflict zones. However, having said that, I think that what I find hugely helpful about about critical concepts is that they make me pay attention to things that the early sort of designers of 1325 already had in mind, those who were, helping to design it, both behind the scenes and then those who eventually got credit for it. But that is that intersectionality helps me to pay attention not only to disadvantage, which it's clearly a concept that points to, the multiple ways in which people are disadvantaged, but it also enables me to look at privilege. And that's what I did in some of the work on masculinity and intersectionality that I did, and some of the work that looks at peacekeepers. And I guess Nina's presentation, which really brought out, some of the problematic rhetoric that surrounds female peacekeepers, but also, that so the majority, if not the exclusive total of female peacekeepers are coming from the global south, as most peacekeepers are from the global south, and that this is a huge this added burden that Nina talks about is hugely important to think about in geopolitical terms, right? So intersectionality allows me to, it stimulates a kind of way of thinking about these disadvantages and these privileges on a global scale as well. The other thing that this critical theory enables me to do is to look at the multiplicity of power relations. So in that sense, I would very much take up gender as a better term with which to think about many of these issues. Although I think women as a political group, as a category, need also to be considered. So I think it's okay for us to be using gender, peace and security and women, peace and security when it's appropriate to do so. What I think we want to avoid is reinforcing that binary between the sort of fixed biological category of women and men, rather than thinking about women and men as a political category. So I think that that's quite problematic. But yeah, so I think it's okay to be kind of confused and to use some of these terms in some contexts and not in others. And I think the last thing that I would say in relation to a lot of these issues is that intersectionality also reminds me to pay attention to systematic and structural power relations, which sometimes get lost in our discussions of particular WPS issues. So this is not to say that you do this at all, Nina. I think, in fact, you point this out quite well in relation to the idea that women will be this panacea to problems in peacekeeping, and that, but of course, women who enter the military, we know from research, often conform to masculine expectations. They, female peacekeepers have told me over the years, I don't understand why you're doing research on gender. These issues have been addressed, for years and years, and it's not a big issue anymore. I mean, but actually what paying attention to multiple systems of power and structural inequalities allows us to do is to continually focus on not so much the individual, but exactly what you were saying, which was the environment, the military organization, the military environment, the conflict setting. What is it about that space that can, that we can intervene in, or we can collectively work towards transforming? And to me, that's what critical theory has enabled me to think about these things and keep these things in mind, keep these ideas in mind when thinking about anything to do with GPS.
Thank you so much. Nina, did you want to add some comments before I move on to the next question?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for the questions that made me think hard. And thank you also to Marcia and Marita for interesting presentations. I think that you brought up the added burden from another perspective, Signe, the one that's coming from, in some context, and I think it should be nuanced again, in some context, male colleagues, male peacekeeping colleagues are seeing their female peacekeeping colleagues as an added burden. And you were bringing up the example of South Africa, where I've been doing research specifically on female and male peacekeepers and the gendered aspect of peacekeeping. And what me and my co-author for these articles, Lindy Heineken, what we found is that female soldiers or female militaries in that military, and I'm not going to generalize further, but I do think that this is something that could be drawn out to other areas as well and other contexts as well, is that many female soldiers are seen more as victims than as soldiers. They're seen as a burden for their male colleagues. At least that's what we found in the interviews, that they were seen as someone that they had to protect rather than seeing them as colleagues that could help the mission. Another aspect that we saw was that they were often sexualized, seen as women that could attract rebels, that could use their femininity in different ways to get more information, which was obviously not something that was put forward in the case of male peacekeepers, even though they themselves had several, they had a lot of relations with the local community themselves, having local girlfriends and so on, but that was not something that was put forward. So this victimization, the sexualization, and then a third aspect that we found was also that the female soldiers were often seen as civilians rather than as militaries. In other words, they were often described as being wives or mothers before being soldiers. So they were seen not in their professional capacity as soldiers or militaries, but rather as their civilian functions as mothers or wives. That's just an aspect to answer the added burden from the male colleagues. But again, I think that these findings need to be contextualized and seen and nuanced as the other. I just wanted to develop what Marcia was saying about how this added burden falls disproportionately on female peacekeepers from the global south. And I think that I don't often use statistics because you can always use them in different ways. But I think here statistics are really useful because we have about 75% of all peacekeepers coming from the global south, from Asia and Africa, and almost 50% of them come from Africa. So here you really have clear evidence that this burden is really very disproportionately put on women from the global south, for peacekeepers from the global south. And then finally, you brought up the question of militarized peacekeeping operations, SIGNE, and specifically MINUSMA. I think, yes, we have been going through the last few years towards this trend to militarize the peacekeeping operations, more robust mandates and so on. But I'm also wondering if this is not something that we need to rethink, given how these operations have developed over time, and how we can see that there needs to be something more than this militarist aspect, because clearly it's not working as it is right now. I don't really see how that aspect is interacting specifically with the female peacekeepers. Of course, you need to have the right person at the right place, but that is not regardless of their gender. And I'll end there and come back.
Thank you. We have several questions, but before I move on to the audience, I wanted to raise an overall question. We have this great panel of speakers, which reflects both Marita's expertise from diplomatic world and foreign ministry, Marcia and Nina focus on research. And what about the general question of the gap between policy and research? I would like to hear from both perspectives. Do you think there is such a gap? For example, Marcia mentioned, what does it mean that when you're involved in working with WPS or GPS, then there becomes issues of maintaining cordial conversations with governments and funders. How does that affect the issue of what researchers catch sight of and what practitioners have the possibility of doing? One of the questions I see on screen has been about what kind of women get involved. Isn't it the case, for example, in the Libyan context, that it's often women who are related to powerful men? What does that mean about being inside and outside the system? And several of the questions ask about concrete strategies. What does it mean to take, for example, the concern with race, intersectionality as a concrete strategy? What can a researcher give, the policy world as a technique, as a litmus question, as a way forward? So if I can get some responses from you on that, then afterwards I'll open up to the audience. Marita, would you like to begin on that?
Sure, I can. I mean, there are so many things I'd like to comment on. First, on academic relations between academics and politicians. Of course, it's hard for me to tell whether the academics we work with feel that they need to deliver something for us, and that they cannot deliver things we don't want, for instance. But I do know this, we use researchers a lot. I have engaged thoroughly with our researchers in Norway, but also elsewhere, as we developed the National Action Plan, for instance. We are working very closely with researchers now as we prepare for the Security Council. They do produce reports and studies for us that are not published because they are to give us insights that cannot necessarily be shared, but they also give us analysis that we didn't ask for, and that makes life challenging at times and rewarding at times. And I find that our relations to academics are paramount in my work, absolutely. So I wanted to say that, and so convey that. I also wanted to comment on, well, you mentioned Libya, and a lot of people would say that about women many places, that who are the women? They are related to the powerful men. They're the wives or the sisters of others. And yes, absolutely, we see that happen, and that is a problem. And that's why we need the gendered actor and conflict analysis, so that we are aware. But I also think we should be very cautious about discrediting women taking part in peace and security matters. We will see the same in Norway, that some powerful men are married to powerful women and vice versa. There is, that should be no surprise. So the fact that you find powerful women in position who also are related to men in powerful positions might be due to the fact that they go in the same circles, they have the same kind of interests. So I think, yes, it's something to watch, but I think we should be careful not to discredit them. Much the same way as we should be careful not to discredit what's often called the elite women. We should be working, I mean, as a government, we continually try to ensure that the so-called elite women build the relations with their constituencies, that we help them backstop regional organizations, that they have input from the grassroots, etc. And we need to be working all these levels and support their efforts to ensure that they are connected, and we also hear the grassroots voices. But I think we really need to watch how we talk about women taking a space taking up space in this field. On gender and women, I think, well, a lot of smart things have been said. I think we need to make sure that we also talk about women specifically, and there are many reasons for that. Not least that women's movement has always been worried that not specifically talking about women might weaken the state of their organizations. We know it's also a term that is often political. And so gender is perceived to be a problem for some organizations. So I think while I will agree that gender is perhaps the best term in order to organize my thoughts, it might not always be the word I choose to use in relation to parties. And for instance, in peace processes, sometimes it might be better to talk about different men and women, or different, well, as soon as you approach gender, at least, it might become difficult. We should do what we can in order to broaden the perspectives, but still we just need to be cautious. Finally, one thing on the added burden on women peacekeepers. I hear what you're saying, and we have a research also from Norway, quite recent, that talks about much of the same issues, and we've been discussing that at length. I also think, though, that we hear very different testimonies. I've spent a lot of time with Bangladeshi peacekeepers, women who feel that they are able to do their job, that they are taken seriously, that they are seen as police and military professionals in their missions. Namibian women as well. Of course, you know this. I'm just sort of adding to that picture, saying that there are different experiences out there. And I know from the Norwegian side, some of the things that we've tried to do is to establish gender fair criteria that you probably heard about, but sort of saying that there are a lot of jobs where you don't need, for instance, upper body strength, and then we should have gender fair criteria so that whoever is the best for the job should be able to take it, and that it should not be favoring men, but also that in positions where upper body strength or other physical requirements are needed, then those criteria should be upheld so that women are not put in a position where they're not able to do the job as well as their male colleagues. There will be women who are able to reach that threshold anyway, and they should not be a burden. They will prove themselves not to be a burden. And I think that's true for Norwegian personnel as well as for the Bangladeshi or Namibians.
Thank you.
Can I
yes,
answer
Nina,
your
please.
question? Yes.
Please.
I think that your question first was about the gap between policy and research, and I think, yes, for sure, there's still a gap. But I think that that's also important because as academics, we are supposed to challenge, to critique, to make the debate alive or keep it alive. But I also think it's important that we reach out through these types of events, through different types of seminars, workshops, etc., where we meet policymakers, where academics and policymakers have the possibility to interact, to share experiences, and perhaps also for us academics to try to make some of our academic work more accessible by writing blog posts, by translating our academic work into different types of policy brief that has a much broader impact and that can reach outside of our academic bubble. But that also goes for policymakers to actually take the knowledge that's there and transform it into policy and not just disregard it as something that's academic, fussy, away from the real world. So I think that there is efforts from both sides to keep this debate alive. And Marita, of course, I'm not saying, I think that most female peacekeepers are doing an excellent, I think basically all. I don't have any idea of how female peacekeepers are doing their jobs, and I don't think that there is an added burden in general at all. I think that if that was how my presentation came out, that's definitely not the way I wanted it to be. And I hear what you're saying, and I think I also agree with you that the right person should be in the right place. And of course, if we're doing these, if we're talking about the tasks that requires a lot of upper body strength, I would say that the majority of those places or those roles will be filled by men, and that's nothing. That's how it should be. The people who are best made for the job should do it. I just think that we should be very careful in the way that we're trying to increase participation and not use gender stereotypical ways of talking about how women could contribute to peacekeeping operations. We shouldn't assume that all women are happy to make connection with women's organizations, local organizations, or that they can better speak to victims from sexual violence. I think this is a question of education. And as far as the peacekeepers that I've interviewed, both from the North and from the South, it's a question of, have you had the education? Can you speak to the victims? It's not because you're a woman that you're better at speaking to victims of sexual violence, for example. It's because you have the adequate education. It's not because you're a woman that you're better to address the local community. If you have the adequate education, then you could do that as well, whether you're a male or a female peacekeepers. So I think my point is that we shouldn't talk about any added value for female peacekeepers. We should say that both male and female peacekeepers are needed. Both have added values in different contexts and different cultures and different conditions. And I think that that's my main point, that this added value is not just, it shouldn't be linked to any gender. Let's say it like that.
Thank you. And Marcia, did you want to add to that before we open up more questions?
Just really briefly about the gap between policy and research, which is just a fascinating. I think it's so dependent and contingent on what government you're talking to and which academic institution you're from. But I definitely think both Marita and Nina are right in that we do need more space for these conversations. Some of the initial conversations that I've had, for example, around things like, deploying female peacekeepers or peacekeepers more generally on shorter rotations, and then replacing those rotations. So instead of a full year rotation, doing a 6-month rotation, so doing almost kind of like job share with another, a male counterpart, so that you have, you have some kind of parity across the year. Things like Norwegian government, for example, giving additional professional benefits to police peacekeepers in terms of flights home paid for, some of them business class, which is about basically saying you won't have to make the decision about going home during the vacation periods or during the rest periods, because we provided you with a ticket already. This is a perk. Whenever I've brought that up with the British government, they've just obsessed with the business class flights and just said, we can't afford that. And it's just like, no, that's not what I'm not saying. Give your military personnel business class flights. What I'm saying is that if you build into the environment support for your personnel to maintain familial relations, to not be abroad for a year like it's some kind of macho test of military strength, that this is a professional job, but you also have family commitments, or you have national commitments, whatever they are. So sometimes there's a reluctance to think strategically in these conversations. And I think that there is sometimes a dismissal of academic ideas as something that are a bit too idealistic. And it's like, well, so what we do need definitely is spaces where we can think about, okay, how could I turn my idealistic, plan into something that you could put into practice that might actually contribute to, making your peace and security policies a little bit more humane for the people who work in those contexts and the people who receive the policies and programs. So maybe I'll just stop there and wait for the rest of the questions.
Okay, thank you. We have a lot of very good questions, and we won't be able to get through all of them. So I'm going to do what I would do if we were sitting in the DIIS auditorium, physically in each other's presence, and group questions. So I'm going to take, as we have the upvote function, I can see which ones have gotten, the upvote from other members of the audience, and I'm going to read out or summarize the first 3 questions, and then ask you each to speak on, well, one of them, or perhaps more if you think, but I won't assign which question for you to speak on. The first one is about the language. We've already talked about it, the choice of focusing on gender instead of women, or gender in addition to women. One of the questions raises the concern whether the language of gender doesn't overlook the structural inequalities in society and also in peace building processes, women in mediation, negotiation, and informal processes. I know Marita has already spoken on that. So if Nina or Marcia, you have some thoughts on that, please keep them in mind. The second question that's gotten a lot of interest is also from an anonymous attendee. Writes, is there a place for the role of sexuality and queerness in this gender, peace, and security agenda? And the third question is something also Marita spoke to initially, but I think we can return to it. To what extent can 1325 be seen as a Western and colonialist agenda? And perhaps following up on this, why, as you said, it was not introduced by a Western colonialist country, why does that question recur? And are there, as another of the questioners asked, some innovations perspectives, frameworks coming from the Global South, which can be highlighted in this discussion. So those were the top 3 questions, and please jump in for the one you think you most want to speak to. Marcia, you're still on screen, so maybe we should go directly to you. Do you want to take up one of those?
Yes, maybe actually one of the, just to slightly return to the previous question around kind of gaps between policy and research, but also between practice and research. I mean, one of the practical ways that the kind of ownership of the WPS and GPS agendas by Global North countries could be challenged is if Global North countries started to reverse the direction of knowledge transfer. So for example, training of peacekeepers. A lot of the training, for example, that the British government has been engaged in has been training peacekeepers in East Africa, for example. I know there is lots of training going on in relation to peacekeepers deployed to Mali, but there's also, this has been going on for so long, training, gender awareness training, different types of roles and different mandates. So doing peacekeeping under different conditions, doing peacekeeping in mixed teams and non-mixed teams, in same-sex teams, so on. So there's so much knowledge that has gone around. And if the majority of Global South peacekeepers are the ones involved in either designing this training or taking this training, why are they not, being asked as experts in Global North context? And if we think about countries like Canada, Sweden, and Norway, for example, I won't put you, Denmark, in the in the frame just yet, but countries that are sort of seen as quintessential peacekeeping countries, also countries where gender equality has been, built into development and humanitarian assistance programs. Why are you not then, looking to the knowledge that has been developed on the ground by, for example, female peacekeepers from South Africa? So I think a reversal of some of this knowledge, and having, the all-female contingent from the Indian militarized police force, there's so many senior women experts who really should be, keynote speakers at some of these events talking about their experiences. And that's what I would say for the one of the ways of challenging this kind of colonial hangovers that we have, in that we see us as the kind of knowledge producers and the others as the recipients of knowledge. And we can just, it's not that difficult to start to disrupt some of that. So that's what I would say on.
Thank you. Marita, did you want to take up one of those questions?
I want to take up all of them.
Okay.
But yeah, I think that's a great idea, Marcia, to begin with. I think we should do that more. We do have, like from the Norwegian side, we have engaged quite a lot with, for instance, Namibia and Bangladesh. We've had bilateral consultations with Argentina, and we've also had meetings with Colombia and others, the Philippines. We've had a lot of meetings between practitioners, but I think you're right that oftentimes what happens is that they ask for a dialogue where we are to share experiences, thinking that they will learn because of the way things have been structured and the way things work. But I think the way I see it, those dialogues, at least the bilateral dialogues that we are having with parties from different sides, they are clearly mutual and they are clearly involving the right people from both sides. But I think more can be done in that regard. So I think that's a great idea to be followed up. I think on whether it's a Western agenda, why it's perceived that way, I also think it's because of the gender equality perspective. It's just assumed. So I think it's our job to amplify the voices of, for instance, Namibians and the Bangladeshi, who say that they are the grandmothers of Security Council Resolution 1325, which is why I always mention that when I talk about these resolutions, that it actually, they were the champions, they were the ones who fought for it, and they are still along with a lot of other countries in Latin America, Asia, and Africa, those who are bringing this agenda forward. And I would say at this point, the most progressive actor we have, multilateral actor we have on women, peace, security is the African Union. That's my point of view, at least. Whether there's space for queers in the gender peace, women, peace, security agenda, well, that's one reason why talking about gender might be helpful, at least for an analytical mind. It's part of not defining everything along those lines of male and female and specific understandings of what that entails. And it's also why we are obsessed with qualifying language. And that's one of the things, building on what you said, Nina, I would absolutely agree with you that we don't want gender stereotypes. And I think both those who defend and who are against sort of this agenda often use gender stereotypical language. So I think it is our role. I do believe that at times, yes, women do things differently from men, and that could be beneficial for a process. But oftentimes it's not, as you say, about gender, but about the gender roles or about the history. It might be because women have had these roles in that society, women have different entry points. And we need to take the time to qualify language to explain that if we do not want to reproduce gender stereotypes. Yeah, I think that was
okay
for now. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks you. And Nina, just to summarize the three questions I threw out, and I'd like you to speak to just one of them of your choice as time is running out, was the question of the use of gender versus women, peace and security, the issue of sexuality and queerness in the women or gender, peace and security agenda, and the issue of Western colonialism and perspectives from the global South. So choose which one of those you want to speak to for a couple of minutes, and then I'll go on to the next round.
Yeah, I think Marcia and Marita have already addressed the questions quite thoroughly, so I don't have anything to add.
Fine.
I prefer to let it more questions from the audience.
Fine. Okay, then let's take the next round. Again, I'm going to take three questions and then let you take a response to at least one of them of your choice. One of them is about what we as Samuel Bertelsen writes, how do we as non-governmental organizations create more awareness on necessities for a better inclusion of women? So this speaks to the side of the role of non-governmental organizations in civil society. Then there's a question about women peacekeepers, something that, of course, Nina has addressed. And what are their vulnerabilities? How important should it be if, in fact, women peacekeepers do become vulnerable to sexual violence? Why should that be a high element on this agenda? And then there's also very interesting questions about how this operates in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. Has that changed the playing field? So why don't we again, I see you on screen from left to right, Marcia, Marita, Nina, which you each take one question you'd like to respond to, and then we'll just wrap up. Marcia first.
Okay, great. I mean, I would take on the question about sexual vulnerability of female peacekeepers. Sorry, Nina, if that was one you were going to take. I mean, you can comment on that too. I just think that, really interesting that these debates and issues around female peacekeepers have actually been around for a really long time. I'm thinking about Louise Olson's very early, it's almost 20 years ago that she wrote actually about female peacekeepers, and some of the same issues are present in contemporary research. So clearly militaries are really not shifting their ideas that much. But this idea of sexual vulnerability, I just, I very much am influenced by the work of Aaron Belkin in his book, Bring Me Men, in which he outlines, that it's a real fallacy for us to see men as somehow impenetrable and to see them as, especially male soldiers. I mean, in fact, actually, all soldiers, like all human beings, are vulnerable to sexual and sexualized forms of violence. And so we, and if we think about these male-dominated environments with military personnel, there is, we need to think about sexual violence prevention information and education for all personnel, all United Nations personnel who are in peacekeeping missions, but also all humanitarian workers. I mean, we've seen some of the statistics around sexual harassment and sexual exploitation and abuse of humanitarian workers themselves by their colleagues. We've seen terrible statistics by US military personnel. So this just to say that is such an important point about vulnerability, but also that the ways that we need to deal with it need to be much broader and expansive so that we can actually be sensitive to all personnel and local people as well.
Marita, why don't we go on to you?
Yes, well, COVID-19, I guess I should be talking about that because it certainly affects our work. I think from the very start, we were very clear from the Norwegian side that we also want other work to continue to the extent possible. That we don't want essential work to stop, such as, for instance, peacebuilding. That said, we do see that a lot of our partners are challenged. A lot of work has to stop, and they have to work differently. So we have stated, along with a lot of other countries, that we will be flexible. We will allow no cost extensions, so a later end state to the project, and also reallocation, so redistribution of personnel, etc., to do other work. And that, of course, is because when there is a crisis, you need to act upon that, and that's also about political leverage. It's also about trust. It's also about feeling the role that you have within your community. And that for a lot of women peace builders who were involved in mediation, they might have to be doing COVID-19 response simply because that's what's most urgent now. This is no news for them. Women peace builders locally have always been adapting to all kinds of crises. So this is just another one. But I think it is paramount that we are able to continue that kind of flexibility, because we do see that the women peace builders that we work closely with and that we all depend on, they are struggling in that regard. I think also focus on their security is paramount. A lot of them are sitting ducks in a situation where they are, where the supervision of the pandemic in a way also leads to them not having the freedom to maneuver and where they're supervised in a different way. So that's something to watch. I think it's also it's a big challenge, the digital gap between women and men, rural and urban areas, lack of proper access to both equipment and internet. We may say that, well, now we can have more meetings with more people, and we can in some, but given the digital gap, we have a problem. And also we know that we might be able to move, for instance, a peace process forward within a delegation where there is trust, but to have meetings between conflict parties is very hard to do. So there are all kinds of effects that we're looking at and that we're working on in different ways. We do see that a lot of the time physical meetings will have to happen to some extent, which in this context means smaller meetings, which again means that very often women have been excluded to a larger extent than before. So we need to be redesigning peace processes and redesigning peace building in many ways, and not only for the sake of women's inclusion, but simply because it needs to be done in a different way in this context. And so I think that the duty of us as governments and civil society and academia is to insist on that new process design be inclusive from the very start.
Thank you. Nina, I'm going to give you the final words before I sum up and close. So to one of the questions I had raised.
Yes, I'd like to address the question about female peacekeepers' vulnerability as well. I think that we often fail to change our regard inwards towards the mission itself, rather than focusing on the vulnerability that female peacekeepers may have in the field of operations. We should look into the mission itself and see how the internal atmosphere within the mission could increase the vulnerabilities, or how that affects female peacekeepers' vulnerabilities. And Marcia already touched upon this, and how we often focus on the external and how we often focus on the mission environment, whether it's a dangerous environment and so on, rather than focus on how is it constituted, are the women safe within the mission itself. So maybe start by looking at the gender education within a mission, and that goes for global north as well as the global south, not just looking at the environment in which they are deployed. And of course, also take into account that men are also vulnerable to sexual violence. This is not just female gendered violence. So this affects both men and women. So I think that that's something to take into account, that and also reflect more upon what Marcia has said about the knowledge production from the global north, that this is also something that we're not just trying to teach lessons to peacekeepers from the global south, especially not given that we're no longer the main peacekeepers anymore. We are the ones who are observing the peacekeepers, but we're definitely not the ones who are contributing troops, and neither is Canada, Sweden, or whoever the main peacekeeping countries before. That's no longer the case. So we should be taking lessons from the ones who are actually in the field and who has the knowledge of what's happening on the ground. And I'll end with that.
Okay, thank you. So I see some of the questions are to specific references. I want to remind the audience that on the DIIS homepage with the link to the seminar, we also have included links to all of our speakers. So you can find their contact, email, and some of their resources. I think it's been a very interesting conversation. We've covered so many different issues about the core tension, what is gained, what is lost in using gender as opposed to women, or when do we have to make those strategic choices, the crucial questions about race, what does it mean to think with race as researchers, what does it mean to work in relation to governments, NGOs, local communities from some of these perspectives. Some of the questions about research and policy, what does it mean in terms of relations between these different kinds of communities? What does it mean to build communication, to develop trust, to put aside some misperceptions one might have of one another? So this is certainly not the end of a conversation, but thank you all for taking time to, especially our speakers and also to our audience.